Army veteran Gregory Edwards was suffering an episode of PTSD when he was arrested in 2018 by West Melbourne police. He was involuntarily committed or Baker acted by the arresting officer and taken to the Brevard County Jail. There at the jail, he got into a fight with deputies, was strapped to a restraint chair, and left alone in a cell for 16 minutes. He died the following day at a local hospital. His death ruled excited delirium by the medical examiner. The footage from inside the Brevard County Jail was released last week after Florida Today sued Brevard County Sheriff Wayne Ivey. Today, we will talk about not only the contents of that footage, but we're going to talk about a much greater issue. What happens to people suffering from PTSD and mental illness, especially when they come in contact with law enforcement? What are some of the reforms that we should be looking at and things that need to change in society? And my three guests today are Jessica Travis, the lawyer who represented Florida Today in its case, the sheriff; Roy Bedard, a security and law enforcement expert retained by Florida Today in its lawsuit; and Scott Robinson, a veteran who served 2 tours in Iraq and a lawyer in Brevard County. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Dr. Bedard, I'm going to start with your report. It's a 70-page report that I read, and there's so many details, but I want to focus on something that you noted in your report, which is it says that when West Melbourne police arrested Edwards outside of a Walmart, they should have seen signs of a psychotic break that's consistent with excited delirium. So my question, just so we can start to understand what was happening, is what were those signs, and what should the arresting officer have done differently? For the record, that excited delirium has not been recognized by the American Medical Association or the American Psychiatric Association, but I know, walk us through what happened that day.
Well, first of all, thanks for having this panel. I think it's very important to talk about these issues and to give some context to not only the theory of jails and mental health and how they interact with each other, but talk about real life cases because they are excellent case studies to learn from. In this particular case, officers of the West Melbourne Police Department responded to a Walmart and found Gregory Edwards being subdued by somebody in a parking lot after having attacked an individual who he didn't know. And the circumstances surrounding that are that Edwards had jumped into a truck that had children's toys in it and started flailing around until he was asked to leave, which he did, and then he became very violent with people in the parking lot. So that's the first indication that a law enforcement officer ought to latch onto. Why is this happening? Is this normal behavior? Certainly it's not normal behavior. It's not even arguably criminal behavior because it seems so unusual. There wasn't a cause for him to jump in the truck. There wasn't a cause for him to use violence. So that would be the first clue to a police officer that perhaps we're not dealing with somebody who is right-minded. So I indicate in my report that officers should recognize that this is part of perhaps a psychotic episode or a psychotic break. It wasn't long before officers learned the truth of the matter that Gregory Edwards the details coming from his wife, was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and had been Baker acted in the past. And for those of you who don't know what Baker acting is, it is a legal consequence that law enforcement officers and others have to be able to involuntarily commit individuals who are a danger to themselves, a danger to someone else, or unable to care for themselves. And typically with a Baker Act, you're brought to a facility where there are mental health professionals that can evaluate you for up to 72 hours. So this is the course of action that law enforcement officers are trained to recognize. On top of this, if you watch the video, you'll notice that the officers had some direct information. When they had Mr. Edwards on the ground, he was not coherent. He was kind of growling, and he was making sort of these guttural sounds. And I think they indicate that in the report. After they get him into custody, there's some mention that he's exhibiting superhuman strength, that he is impervious to pain. All of these are indicators of somebody who could be suffering from a phenomenon known as excited delirium syndrome. It could be other phenomena as well. But excited delirium syndrome is really important to law enforcement because we're seeing a proliferation of stimulant drugs in society. And as a circumstantial set of criteria, we know that it's a rapidly deteriorating condition. And so you have to react to it very quickly, or somebody can simply die based on the fact that they are having a meltdown, a physiological process. So we expect our officers to have proper training to identify those features and then to respond appropriately to those features by bringing them to the appropriate mental health facility for stabilization and treatment.
Yeah, and like I stated previously, Mr. Edwards was Baker acted. I think when people hear that somebody is getting Baker acted, at least the general public assumes that they're being taken to a mental health facility. That seems to be the purpose of the Baker Act. However, he was still taken to the Brevard County Jail. And Jessica and Scott, please chime in if you can. And then why did that happen? Why didn't they take him to the appropriate facility? As we know, jails are not equipped to deal with people suffering from mental illness or having a psychotic break, as you described.
Well, unfortunately, this isn't uncommon in Brevard County, where the police encounter someone with mental illness and they treat it like a criminal case. And they are taken to the jail simultaneous with Baker Act paperwork, meaning if they happen to make bond or otherwise released, they are often then taken to care, etc. Why this is done, I don't know. It's been a concern of mine as an attorney in Brevard County for some time now, that there's this gap between the person who is mentally ill and their first contact with the police to them getting into the court system. So unfortunately, this is not uncommon. I don't know why it's happening, and it's something that needs to change. I have in the past read police reports in which police tried to take the individual to circles of care, and circles of care did not have a bed for them. And so then they were instead arrested and taken to the jail on some sort of resisting with violence or without violence type charge, an obstruction type charge. Jails shouldn't be a substitute for mental health facilities. And unfortunately, that is where a large portion of our mentally ill are ending up.
Scott, would you like to add anything? And not only are you a lawyer who's familiar with the system, but you're also a veteran yourself. And by the way, we're seeing footage here of Mr. Edwards at the Brevard County Jail.
I don't have much to add. I agree with Jessica. The real issue is we don't know. I don't know why you'd fill out paperwork, meaning you recognize that somebody was a candidate to be Baker acted, but not take them to a facility. So,
if I could say one thing to that, I just want to make it very clear, this is not a problem that's unique to Brevard County. I work a lot of cases, not only throughout the state of Florida, but throughout the country. And what we find is that this is a common problem where we don't have community coordination. Sometimes we don't have community resources. We don't have enough community money to be able to handle these kind of problems. So I think it's important for everyone to realize that what happened in Brevard County happens every day throughout America, probably not with the same consequences suffered by Mr. Edwards, but serious mistreatment of individuals who are treated and processed as if they're criminal, when in fact they are having a mental episode that would be better treated with mental health professionals.
Yeah, and I want to talk about what happened inside the jail as well once he's there. And if I really also encourage people to watch this video. It's over 2 hours long, but watch it and make up your own mind about it. But he spent several minutes inside a cell waiting to be booked, and you could see that he was growing restless and showing behavior that wasn't, I would say, common. I mean, could deputies, should they have noticed that? Should they have, I think that, and that's a question that I'm getting from a lot of people. Should they have done something different when they saw that he was presenting this sort of behavior?
Is that a question for me?
For any of you who want to take it.
Perhaps I'm best to answer it because I talk a little bit about that in my report. And the answer is yes, they should have. But you also have to understand the context of the jail is that this is, in many cases, viewed as a routine incident. They see a lot of different people who have a lot of different manifestations, sometimes from being drunk, sometimes from doing drugs, and a lot of times from mental illness. I think there's an estimate to about 25 to 40% of the calls for service of law enforcement are mental health related. So it's not uncommon for the jail to see this kind of thing. And usually the day begins and ends approximately the same. So nobody gets too unnerved about someone like Mr. Edwards, who is doing the kind of things that you're watching on the video right now. But yes, it would be better to have monitored him, because knowing that, you would see the downward spiral as he comes in quite calm. He's probably somewhere in the middle of an episode from what we see in the parking lot of Walmart to the back seat of the officer's car, now calmed down and ready to be agitated again when he's finally grabbed by the deputy. So this isn't the beginning of something. He's in the middle of something. And unfortunately, the knowledge, I think, that the officers had on the scene wasn't appropriately passed on to the jail for them to know that this is somebody that needed special attention. He came in as a violent criminal, not as somebody who was suffering a psychotic episode. And I think that matters. And I think, some credit should be given to the jail in terms of not viewing this as an underreaction. This was a very common thing that they're used to seeing all the time. But with hindsight bias, we can say that had they been watching him, perhaps they would have handled it different.
And obviously, I have a few more questions about what happened and things that we saw in your report, but I go back to, what's the missing link here? You just said that a lot of people are Baker Act and is still taken to the jail. This is not something out of the ordinary. So how do we address this? I think that's the question that a lot of people are going to be asking themselves. Is it training for law enforcement? I mean, you guys are the experts, but, this seems like a very difficult issue to solve. But if we can at least try to think of some solutions to what could have, if these things have been in place, perhaps the outcome could have been different.
I think there's certainly a gap. I mean, the court system has recognized that veterans might be deserving of special consideration, and they put in place a veterans court and also a mental health court. And Scott can talk more to that. So we have this recognition in the court system, but when the person first interacts with the police, there is this gap in time where things are potentially not being handled correctly. And what that means is you have a mentally ill person who may or may not be using drugs. And I want to clarify, there was some discussion about excited delirium in this case. We don't know if this is an excited delirium case. It's a questionable conclusion. There were things that the medical examiner did not do, or signs of excited delirium that we did not see in this case. For one, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that Gregory Edwards was supposedly huffing. That is a narrative that is without evidence. His toxicology was completely clean. Even if he had been huffing, that drug is a depressant, not a stimulant. And that's important because Dr. Bedard just indicated that we've seen an uptick in suspected excited delirium cases related to stimulant use. This is not a stimulant use case. There's no indication of drug use whatsoever. There was Benadryl in the system and Narcan, but that was administered by the jail staff and the medical after he was found non-responsive. So the other things that are missing in this case in regards to excited delirium is that there was really no indication that he had a high temperature. And Dr. Bedard can speak in more detail to that. And really then Dr. Bedard can confirm that the only way to confirm excited delirium diagnosis is to send the brain off, slides of the brain to be tested. And that was not done by the medical examiner in this case. In fact, the brain is one of the organs that is missing, or at least has not been returned to the family. The other organ that has not been returned to the family is the kidney. And the medical examiner did not address, and the reports have not addressed the fact that after Mr. Edwards was taken to the hospital, he had blood coming from his urethra or penis, which could indicate a kidney injury. These are things that we don't know. So that aside, there is a gap when people who are mentally ill first, the way that we treat them, they first interact with the police to the time that they get into the court system, and then maybe they're recognized to have a mental illness or to need to go into veterans court. And what happens in that gap is, we've already talked about, they're treated like a criminal. A lot of these people are legally incompetent, meaning the law recognizes that they are so mentally ill that they're not able to make legal decisions for themselves. And the process for getting someone evaluated for legal incompetency is that they're at the jail, and a psychologist has to go see them and evaluate them and write a report and present it to the court. And this process often takes months. And so in the meantime, the mentally ill person is brought into the jail, and because they're mentally ill, they're often put in what the inmates refer to as a turtle suit. It is a padded green suit that's held together by Velcro that's supposed to not allow them to tear it apart or to potentially harm themselves. And they're put in a cell at the Brevard County Jail in what's called the 500 pod. The inmates call it the bubble. And they're put in a cell. There's no bed. There's no bedding. It's just 4 walls, a floor, and a toilet. And they're often put in there with 4 to 5 other guys who also have mental health or drug issues. And they barely have enough room to lay down, honestly. I've been down in the 500 pod with my most mentally ill clients. And they sit there for months waiting to be evaluated to determine whether or not they're competent and they can make decisions on their case and their case can go forward. So we have the mental health court, et cetera, but there is this delay. And so it would be nice if there are some policies in place, and Dr. Bedard could speak to those, but if there would be maybe better policies, or if the policies were followed, or if there was training, or there was some better interaction between the police and the EMTs. Now, that's a lot to ask of a police officer, to show up and not only restore order and gain control, but also mentally assess someone. That's a lot. And so maybe it's something that a specially trained mental health type EMT, like a mental health ambulance or something like that, would be better equipped to do. It's important to know in this case that the EMTs did respond to the Walmart, but they never medically checked. I don't know that they would have done a mental check because they're not trained to do that. They're mostly trained to do a medical check, but they never medically checked Mr. Edwards. And so that he was taken to the jail without even a medical check. So we need to make sure that the EMTs are doing their job, but also we might need to add an extra layer or an extra person with the EMTs or an extra training for someone to do a true mental health evaluation on scene to determine whether or not they actually need to go to the jail or they need to go to circles of care. In my ideal world, that would be something that was done in conjunction with a place like Circles of Care. But Circles of Care has limited funding. So I think it all comes down to community awareness, community interest, and then pushing to have better funding.
Yeah, and I believe Florida is among the states with worst funding for mental health. But yeah, it does seem like a very complicated issue. Does anybody want to add anything before we move on?
I got something I'd like to say. Your original question is what can be done. Law enforcement does have training on how to deal with people who are suffering a mental health crisis. They know to Baker Act somebody, and so I think the issue is how do you get them to do that? And probably one of the best ways is just public awareness. If if people know that this is an option and they have training on this and law enforcement is not following it, I think it'll affect, because people will put pressure on the politicians and the sheriff's a politician, and they will do what their constituents expect them to do. But otherwise, there's really not a way to force law enforcement to do that. So if they have somebody who's clearly having some type of psychological break, they take them to the jail, and they sit in the jail for 20, 24, 48 hours, and maybe more, depending on the facts and circumstances. There's really not a viable way other than an attorney trying to get somebody bond to get them out. We really can't force them to do anything. We can't coerce them to do anything. And to that point, one of the things as a criminal defense attorney, a lot of times represent people who do have psychological issues. And one of the things that we always try to do is make sure when we represent somebody that we get a pretty substantial list of emergency contact names. Because if somebody calls us and they are suffering a mental health crisis or some type of problem, I don't want to call law enforcement, because the fear is that law enforcement is going to go to that client's house and arrest them. They'll go in there and maybe there's a bond condition or who knows, or something that they see. And instead of getting the client to where we'd like him to go, which is to get some type of help, they take him to the jail, their bond's revoked, and they sit in jail. So what we have to do is start calling family members to get down there, to get the person, and then get them over to basically, a family member can't have somebody Baker acted.
Oh. And Dr. Bedard, I want to go back to your report for a second. You outlined several policies several sheriff's office policies that were violated in how they handled Edwards. I know it's a really long report, but can you just briefly describe what violations happened here and why it's important that we talk about them?
Well, to be clear, when Mr. Edwards first started to act out, the officers were compelled to take him under control, and they used tactics and they used tools that are common for law enforcement officials, including correctional officers. They used strikes to various parts of his body in an attempt to cause what we call muscular dysfunction, so that they could get him into a position where he could be properly handcuffed and taken into control without any further harm to himself or others. They pepper sprayed him, they tased him, they used a chemical to get an advantage over him while they were struggling with him on the ground. And perhaps he was exhibiting superhuman strength. And at that point, the leverage techniques of the officers kind of wear out. There's not the ability to get his arms, for example, out from underneath him, or to get him onto his stomach, which is so necessary to placing him in the right position first before you can handcuff him. And then ultimately they tase him, which of course is a cycle of electricity that goes through your body and causes similarly that muscular dysfunction by disrupting the body's electrical system. All of those things are valid. They're not violations of policy. It's a very messy scene. Violence is hard to watch. I think it's disturbing to even see the videos that you're playing now, but none of this stuff is considered excessive. None of this is considered inappropriate based on the fact that they are in a fight with Mr. Edwards. Now, once they get him under control, this is where the policy violations, as I see it, begin. There are certain post effects that all of those things have. If you punch somebody, you should anticipate that you've got soft tissue injuries. If you spray somebody and they're contaminated, they're suffering from the effects of that. And it doesn't just stop when they stop resisting. It can last an hour, where you have a very intense burning sensation in your soft tissue areas. It is in fact a inflammatory agent. So all of the soft tissue is inflaming internally and externally. It's very, very painful experience that can be remedied, for example, with water. The jail is a great place to decontaminate because, first of all, you will have so many police personnel around you, but you have showers there as well. Take them into the showers. Let's decontaminate them. And then also, when you fire a taser into somebody, these are nothing more than straightened out fish hooks. They're barbs. They hurt. They're not excruciating, but certainly if you leave them in there, you have metal prongs sticking in your body. So it's important that you take them out. And sometimes they become so complicatedly interwoven with the skin that it requires medical personnel to take them out. Well, they're left in there as well. So we have another policy violation: no decontamination, not removing the barbs. Finally, they end up getting him handcuffed, hands behind the back, as they've been trained to do. But you'll notice the emergency restraint chair is a 7-point restraint system. It restrains you at the waist, both of your ankles. It restrains your shoulders, and it restrains your wrists. So we've got 7 points of your body that cause you to be virtually immobile. You can hardly move at all, but slight twitches, as you'll see when they get them strapped in. There is a hole in the back of that ERC for a temporary placement of somebody's hands who might be placed in handcuffs. But as soon as you are strapped in, and as soon as you are controlled, you are to take the handcuffs off and place them on the chair rails and then fasten them to the straps that are built into the chair. This doesn't happen. So what happens with the consequence of having handcuffs on a body is that there's always a forward pull of your shoulders. There's always a tendency anatomically to pull forward, which means that your hands are constantly pulling against inflexible metal handcuffs, which causes swelling. Now we have a complication. Even if the cuffs are put on correctly with the appropriate amount of space, if your arms or your wrists begin to start swelling, suddenly the cuffs are too tight, and you can suffer circulation issues. You could even suffer neural issues, something known as handcuff neuropathy that many doctors are very familiar with. So they don't do this. They don't take the handcuffs off. They leave them on him, and they don't appropriately place him in the chair as manufacturer recommends and as their policy recommends. Of course, we don't see any medical personnel inspecting the straps or inspecting Mr. Edwards for injury, as is required after use of force, according to the Brevard County Sheriff's Office policy. And then finally, when they wheel him into the holding cell, note that they put a hood over his head. And this hood is a very breathable hood. It is a fishnet kind of structure with holes throughout. But remember what we've done. We've got somebody that we've contaminated. So we have biofluids that are naturally running out of his nose and mouth. There's mucus, there's spit. If he's been hit in the face during the struggle, perhaps there's blood. Who knows if he's going to vomit? I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen inside of a hood. You've got to watch him when you place those hoods on him. And they leave him sitting there for 16 minutes, virtually unwatched. There are some examples of people walking by the windows. We didn't redact those so that the public could actually see how many times that happens. It's not only very minimal, but the time that they walk by, no one stops and really peers in for any significant amount of time. So throughout this process, we have Mr. Edwards in distress and nobody's tending to him. So these are all policy violations by the BCSO policy, nothing I wrote, and by the way, they're responsible policies. They're just not being followed. So I point those out in my report.
Wow. Anything Scott and Jessica want to add about that?
Well, I think, Dr. Bedard and I sat for 3 days with a videographer and went frame by frame to create a video that we thought would meet the sheriff's security concerns, but also tell the public what happened from the time that Gregory Edwards got to the jail to the time that unfortunately he was wheeled out. And I will tell you that when I first got the video, it hit me that I was probably the first person to actually watch it outside of law enforcement in Brevard County, and the magnitude hit me. And then when I watched it, it was very difficult to watch how he was treated after the fact, almost as if he was punished for some reason. It was difficult to watch him attempt to breathe. But I will tell you, the thing that struck me as I watched it was the fact that I realized that they had left the taser probes with the barbs, the fish hook barb, in his butt, basically, and strapped him in that chair that tight. And why that hit me so hard was that wasn't mentioned in any of Brevard County Sheriff's investigative reports. They had omitted that. And so they had instead said that he was, violent and fighting the whole time and resisting the whole time, even when he was in the chair. And you do see him squirming at times. He's lifted from the floor. He's kind of a sack of potatoes at that point, but the chair seems to come to or revive. But really, once he's wheeled into that final cell, that's cell 9, he starts fighting. I think he realizes they're going to leave him there. And you do see him squirming, and you realize that he has those taser probes in him still. And the way that we came to realize that is we were watching the video, and then when they came in and to find him non-responsive, you see them winding up some wires, and that's the first thing they attempt to do, rather than to potentially revive him and put oxygen on him, is to then at that point remove the taser probes, and the wires are still attached. Those wires have been cut. So that was pretty hard to watch. It was pretty hard to hear the reporting from the sheriff's department about this case, the public statements that have been made after watching that video, and to know that the sheriff had exaggerated to a large degree what actually happened. We can now see it for our own eyes. We can see that he was non-compliant, but he wasn't a violent man that had attempted murder, that had fought for 3 hours. Has been portrayed in the sheriff's public comments. And the reason that this, there was other things that were not really forthcoming, but this bothers me as a defense attorney, is that I know our mental health situation is not going to get better in the future. The police are going to interact more and more with people who have mental health issues. It's just a factor of where we are, whether it be genetics or environment or aging. Unfortunately, a lot of people that are interacted are elderly who begin to have dementia. And when I see a department that exaggerates or omits things from the reports, it makes me feel for those veterans who might be experiencing PTSD, or somebody with a family member, because I know that erodes the trust. And that's what Scott was, referring to, is that it's unfortunate in this time that people don't want to call the police for help when they're in this situation, because they know it could potentially be a death sentence, or at least criminal charges, with the way that it has gone from here at this point. So I really hope that we can change the public awareness, that we can have some empathy for those who are mentally ill, even those who are using drugs, because often drugs are a symptom of mental illness or a way to treat or cope. That we can have a certain degree of empathy, and that we can start demanding better of our elected public servants. They are there to serve us, and they need to serve us and do their job, and do their job well. And I think that is the lesson that we learned from Gregory Edwards' case, that things were not done right, that the things that were not done right were doubled down on, and we're going to continue to have this problem unless Brevard County Public demands that our elected officials do better and handle those in mental health crisis better than they did in this case.
And by the way, I just want to make a note of when we were talking about the restraint chair and the spit hood, that the Brevard County Sheriff's Office has changed its policies regarding that. So it's important to know that they have made changes, largely because of this case. It's important to give credit where credit is due, obviously. And we're roughly at 33 minutes here, but I do have a more of a broader question. In recent years, I've heard a lot of people criticize the movement to deinstitutionalize people, basically removing them from state-run mental health facilities. And now I think it's not a surprise that jails have become housing facilities for the mentally ill. I mean, do you see those parallels? Are there things that we did decades ago that are probably playing a factor in here? I'm not talking specifically about the Edwards case, but just this mental health crisis that we see today in America.
Yes, I think it's reshaped law enforcement in whole. I think law enforcement officers, if you go back previous to the 1950s, which is really when the movement started, it took strong hold in the 1960s and went all the way up to the 1990s before there was full deinstitutionalization. But throughout that entire time period, law enforcement officers had to become more and more used to interacting with people who were otherwise essentially patients, and they didn't have the education or the schooling or frankly the desire to do that. Part of the problem with the mentally ill is sometimes you don't know they're mentally ill just by looking at them. Sometimes you have to observe their behavior for long periods of time to say, hey, something's wrong with this person. And the nice thing about institutionalization is that there is proper assessments that are able to diagnose and properly treat individuals who have long-term problems. But law enforcement has always been a short-term problem solver, as are the jails. They are not intended to deal with long-term problems, but law enforcement has been handled long-term problems fairly routinely. Things like domestic violence, for example. We show up at a house and intend to solve, 20 years of conflict in 20 minutes, or child parent related issues where you have unruly children. Law enforcement gets called to those and expected to have the big answers for things that perhaps have been going on for 10, 15 years. So in some respects, law enforcement are really referral agencies. And the problem with the mental health world is that we have nowhere to refer them to with deinstitutionalization, except we have tried to create community mental health services, and they are failing, I think, when it comes to street level problems that are identified by law enforcement officer and need immediate attention. And so the idea of deinstitutionalization, just to sound somewhat crass, it's true that crazy people aren't criminal, and that has been repeated many times. And I think law enforcement officers accept that fact, that you don't have to be criminal because you are mentally ill, but they don't know what to do with individuals. And so there has been some training that is provided to say these are your resources, but unfortunately in many communities there is some territorialism that's going on, and there's some systemic breakdown. So the sheriff's department or the police department isn't talking to the mental health facility, who isn't talking to the EMTs, and they don't have a coordinated plan that if somebody, if we receive a phone call, for example, somebody's running around the neighborhood naked and howling at the moon, who shows up? Well, we should recognize that as a sign and symptom of mental health, and we should have a coordinated response from multiple agencies, not just law enforcement. And it's not happening. And so consequently, law enforcement does what it knows how to do. It throws handcuffs on you and takes you somewhere as a short-term problem, even though it's dealing with a long-term circumstance. So we probably need to rethink institutionalization. Our knee-jerk reaction to have closing asylums and closing mental state hospitals has not worked out very well. It has created problems that we haven't had in the past, and I'm afraid they're escalating because of modern circumstances that weren't even around in the 1960s when we began to deinstitutionalize.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, I'm seeing a lot of comments about huffing, and I know, Jessica, you already talked about it, but just to just put it on the record here that there is no indication, or we don't know if he was huffing. There was nothing found in his toxicology. Well, right. We do know that his wife says she saw canisters in a way tested. But can you clarify that? Because I know that's something that the Sheriff Wayne Ivey has been continues to insist that he was huffing, and it's showing up here. So can you just kind of repeat?
So, after this incident, which Gregory Edwards was taken to the hospital, obviously he was extremely critical. He never regained consciousness, and the sheriff sent 2 female deputies out to Miss Edwards' house. She was, I think, 9 months pregnant at the time. She was about to give birth, and she had obviously a young daughter that we saw in the video earlier. And she, I think, knew that Mr. Edwards would probably be hospitalized for mental health issues. In fact, she had told them at Walmart that she had planned on taking him to the VA the next day because this happened on a Sunday and she was going to take him on a Monday. So when the officers showed up and they interviewed her, they told her that he had had a medical incident. And she asked if he was in a fight or something, and they said, no, he just had this medical incident. And she asked for details, and they weren't really forthcoming about what happened to him. And they started to ask her questions about, well, how does he use drugs? And as by way of some sort of finding some sort of cause about why he acted that way. And she speculated, saying, well, I have noticed these aerosol cans of dust in the trash, and she showed it to them, but she clarified that she had not seen him doing it. But she did think that it was weird that there was that many cans of dust in there, so she speculated that he could have been huffing. That narrative, but that she had not seen him that day, the day of his arrest, huffing. If he had done it, it must have been in the past, but she had never seen it. That was picked up by Sheriff Ivey. as some sort of, I think, a red herring. And this is why I think that that is a red herring. There was no evidence. There was no drug associated with huffing found in the toxicology that was done on the autopsy. I also think that's a red herring because that drug is a depressant, not a stimulant. So a stimulant would make you act crazy and act out and potentially fight people. Depressant would mellow you out. So if he had been huffing that day, his conduct was not consistent with a depressant. And also, if he had been huffing, it's my understanding, I'm not a toxicology expert, but an attorney that's worked with this, that, if you huff, you have some sort of effect, but it doesn't linger. And so we see from the video that his behavior is not consistent with someone who's been huffing. He's acting out, as fighting out. And then he also, when he comes into the jail, he has periods where he's calm. And it's only when he gets out and he doesn't want to go do whatever the deputy's telling him to do that he becomes, resistant, and they have this leg sweep where they end up on the floor, and then the fight goes from there. So I personally think that that is a red herring to try to distract from the very obvious policy violations. By the way, policy violations that we would not have known about had Florida Today not spent the time and the money to get the public the video. So I would encourage the public not to be distracted by that narrative, to look at the video, to look at the evidence, which that there was no drugs indicating huffing in Mr. Edwards' system. That was something that was picked up on. It was speculative, and it's just not there.
I actually got a good question from Stell Bailey. What kind of resources does Brevard have for mental health? Is it just circles of care? Good question, if you guys know the answer. I
think, Scott, can you answer that?
Pretty much it is circles of care. I think they've got 3 or 4 facilities. I think Stewart has a facility in Rockledge. And then there's a new one in Titusville, but I'm not familiar with it. So but the majority people wind up going to circles.
Let me add one thing to that, and that goes back to the excited delirium. And once again, I'm not affirming that it was excited delirium. I don't know, but that is what was listed on the death report. There is also the local hospital. The problem with excited delirium is that it's not just a temporary psychological state. It is a rapidly deteriorating physiological phenomena that kills you. You have a actual physical meltdown. You suffer from acidosis. Your pH gets out of whack and your organs shut down. And it happens in a very, very quick time unless we reverse the process, usually through sedatives. This isn't something that Circle of Care can even properly administer. We need a medical technician who is there able to administer that sedative. That needs to be part of the response team to somebody who we believe has excited delirium. And this is something that's going to require a tabletop discussion between the existing local groups, as I said, to give up some of the territorialism of what they do to work together for these kind of cases. So it's important to recognize that, because excited delirium is a psychological phenomena, but it has physiological consequences that usually result in dying. And we don't want to put that out of our mind. If this was a case of excited delirium syndrome, it was just completely mishandled.
Thank you. And we're running out of time, but I have one more question. I don't even know if y'all can answer it, but I think there is a sense, I think a lot of people are wondering, could his death been avoided? I know that's a hypothetical question, so I'm going to preface it as that. But could somebody have taken steps that could have changed the outcome of this in light of his mental illness and things that were known at the time of his arrest?
Well, I think so, but maybe Dr. Bedard is better to speak to this. I mean, I think he can elaborate, but they could have, if this is a true excited delirium case, which there's a lot of question about excited delirium and whether or not this was an excited delirium case, they can give people, medicine to calm them down, to keep them from going into that meltdown that Dr. Bedard mentioned. They also, I am a firm believer that had Brevard County Jail followed their procedures, the procedures call for people who are in a restraint chair, people who have been tased, to be monitored and checked by medical staff. That was not done in this case. I don't care if somebody walks by or stands there for 6 seconds. That's insufficient. Their procedures also call for them to decontaminate someone not put a spit hood on them. He was not actively spitting. That's another narrative that I've heard. The deputies themselves indicated he was not actively spitting. Instead, they put a spit hood on him and they left him in there with the probes in him to just do and suffer unnecessarily. So I think that had they followed their procedures, we don't know what caused his death, honestly. I question the excited delirium. We know he was in this use of force scenario where he had some injuries. But we don't know what caused his death. Had they followed their policy, I think they would have caught him before he went non-responsive and was not able to ever revive him, be revived again. I mean, we see that at that moment when the attention is called to him is basically the same time where he goes limp and they're not able to revive him. Had they done the proper medical checks on him, I think they could have caught him and realized that he was in distress, but they just didn't do it. So I think they could have saved him.
And to further speculate, because we don't know if he could have been saved, but this, as I think I'll reiterate what I said earlier, this problem begins at the very beginning. It begins with the police response long before he gets to the Brevard County Jail. It's just an improper response to somebody that you anticipate may be suffering from excited delirium. It's like anything else. If you have chest pains, you assume the worst, you go to the hospital. Perhaps it's a heart attack, perhaps it's just a state of anxiety. So law enforcement officers are trained to do that, to not make medical diagnosis on their own street side and say, he doesn't look too bad, let's take him to the jail, but to actually deal with the symptoms they're observing. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say in terms of could he have been saved, remember, we haven't talked about this, but in the ME's report, it turns out that he has an ischemic brain injury. He's suffering from hypoxia. This occurs when you have a reduction of oxygen to the brain. Why does that happen? We don't see anywhere on the videotape. And I look at videotapes like this all the time. Sometimes it's very obvious. You see somebody put in a chokehold and you go, okay, that's probably the mechanism of injury that causes this. We don't know why he has hypoxia, except we do know something is not right when we see the hood placed on him and him not being washed. I'm interested to know, was that hood occluded? Was it possible for air to get through there? If it were the case that he was, for example, gasping for air, it's hard to know what his state of mind was when he's sitting there because there's no audio. We can't really hear what's going on. We can watch him. He's writhing in the chair. His mouth is agape. We don't know exactly if he's suffering from not getting enough oxygen, but it's a strong possibility that perhaps that's happening. Here's the problem. They take the hood off and throw it away. We're not able to examine it. So that is another policy violation, by the way, and also a terrible break in chain of custody for a very important piece of evidence. So I think to your question, there are things that could have been done that may have saved his life, very, very well likely may have saved his life had the officer responded appropriately, reacted appropriately, got him to the proper resource, took advantage of the fact that the ambulance was even there, didn't just kind of wave it off and say, is he good, but really made sure that there was a medical inspection as to his state. That may have saved his life. Had the hood not been placed on, had his airway not been obstructed, that may have saved his life. So I think there's a lot of problems with the continuum of what happened in which we can speculate that perhaps this is what caused his death. And I think I would be remiss in saying it could be none of those things. It could be something completely different. So I'm not here to draw a diagnostic, but simply to say that things were mishandled that may have made a difference.
Anything else before we wrap up? By the way, go ahead, Scott.
I was just saying, I agree. I don't think he should have ever been at the jail. I mean, we focused on excited delirium, but I mean, this could have been any number of issues. He could have had an adverse, we'll just say an average person. They could have had an adverse reaction to medication they're taking, which caused a psychological break. You could have had somebody who has autism or some other type of condition. And the bottom line is that when you come across these people that really, they need help, they need assistance, they are not acting normally, the wrong action is to take them and then put them in a cage. Put them in a cage in the back of a car, wrestle them to the ground, put them in the cage of the jail. These are individuals who I'm sure everybody somewhere in their life knows. And when they're in that situation, the question you have to ask yourself is, if it was my mother or my father or my friend or my soldier or somebody else, a family member, what would you expect? And I think ultimately what you would expect is that they're going to try to get this person help. And that didn't happen here. And now we're today talking about it.
By the way, someone asked about policy changes at the Brevard County Sheriff's Office. There's a story at floridatoday.com about it, but just to briefly summarize it, the policy now requires deputies to continuously observe inmates who have been secured in the restraint chair while wearing a spit hood until the hood is removed. There's more in our story, so please go and read that. I want to thank our panel for doing this. It's obviously a very unfortunate circumstance, but I think that you have done a great job informing the public, and thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.